Good afternoon, everyone. Very welcome to the Institute of Sacred Music. Welcome to our great hall. I'm Martin Jean, director, and it's a great pleasure to welcome distinguished alumna and theologian, Dr. Catherine Vincie, who will give today's Kavanagh lecture. Welcome, of course, to all of you to this annual endowed lectureship. This was begun by my predecessor, Margot Fassler, in the late 90s as a way both to bring the very most current and critical scholarly work in liturgical studies here to Yale, but also as a way to honor our late Professor Emeritus, Father Aidan Kavanagh, and to honor him and his memory. Dr. Kavanagh, as you may know, was Professor of Liturgical Studies here at Yale for 20 years until his retirement in 1994. During that time, he was also interim director of the ISM and interim dean of Yale Divinity School, so he wore many, many different hats. And since the beginning of this lectureship, we've brought some of the great minds here in liturgical studies, including Gabriel Winkler, Gordon Lathrop, Janet Walton, Max Johnson, Karen Westerfield Tucker, John Baldwin, and today, Dr. Catherine Vincie. It's a great pleasure to hand the mic over to Teresa Berger, who will introduce her more formally now.
My name is Teresa Berger. I teach liturgical studies here and convene the program in liturgical studies, and in that capacity it is my privilege and also a great pleasure to introduce to you our Kavanagh lecturer for this year, Professor Catherine Vincie. Catherine Vincie is Professor of Liturgy and Sacraments at the Aquinas Institute of Theology in St. Louis, Missouri, where she has taught since 1995. She's a graduate both of Yale Divinity School and of the ISM, and in fact knew and took classes, I assume, with Aidan Kavanagh. Maybe you did. Her giving the Kavanagh lectures this year is a homecoming of sorts for her, and we are very glad to welcome you back. She also garnered several prizes while she was here, amongst them the faculty prize from the ISM, I think. Professor Vincie went from here to a doctorate in liturgical theology at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. in 1990. She's the author of a number of important publications in our field, and I'm simply focusing on the two most recent, Celebrating Divine Mystery, a primer in liturgical theology, and then only a year old, Worship and the New Cosmology. There is also a book in press, the Handbook on Catholic Preaching, should be out in a few months, I think. Catherine is not only a scholar of liturgy, but also an active participant and shaper of liturgical life in the Roman Catholic Church. And again, I highlight just a couple of things. She served on the Advisory Council of ISIL, the International Commission on English in the Liturgy, which cannot have been fun. She's coordinator of chapel at the Aquinas Institute of Theology, and she's also a church musician, an organist and a pianist, and served in that capacity at St. Thomas More, the Catholic Center in New Haven, while she studied here. Finally, she belongs to a religious community of women, the Religious of the Sacred Heart of Mary, and serves as the provincial counselor of her community this year and well into the coming years. It's a privilege indeed to have Professor Vincie with us. Her 2015 Kavanagh lecture is entitled Shooting for the Stars, Worship and the New Cosmology. Please join me in welcoming Professor Vincie back.
Well, thank you very much, Martin and Teresa, for that lovely introduction. It's delightful to be back. I had a wonderful time here while I was a student, and certainly wish those of you who are studying here now, I hope that your time here could be as formative for you as this was for me. Now, by way of introduction, let me just say that the invitation to give this lecture, which honors the legacy of Father Aidan Kavanagh, has given me the opportunity to assess my own work in liturgical theology against with his contribution to the field as well. It's in the spirit of gratitude and collegial critique of Aidan Kavanagh's work that I begin my own comments today. I would be remiss in not acknowledging his lasting legacy, but also disingenuous not to admit right from the beginning that Aidan and I did not see eye to eye on many things, and we still don't. While such an appraisal is at least honest, my hope is that our respective positions can both serve the Church as we seek to respond to the divine offer of love in its public worship. Well, Aidan Kavanagh was famous for his position that the worship of the Christian churches is primary theology. It is, in Kavanagh's words, the Church caught in the act of being most overtly itself as it stands faithfully in the presence of the one who is both object and source of that faith, unquote. The liturgical assembly, he goes on to explain, is profoundly affected by the encounter with the living God, and it is the assembly's continuing adjustment to that change that constitutes theology itself. This is primary theology in his view, not the secondary theology of liturgical or other theological work, once removed from the divine-human encounter that constitutes worship. For Kavanagh, the process of primary theology is a threefold process, a threefold dialectic between the thesis of the assembly's liturgical act, the antithesis of the changed condition which results from the divine-human encounter, and its synthesis in the assembly's adjustment in faith and works to that encounter. Kavanagh's position on this, in my view, constitutes one of his most significant contributions to the field of liturgical theology. It places the church gathered, the liturgical assembly, a diverse community of believers, as subject of the ongoing dialogue with divine mystery, who always and everywhere initiates that dialogue. It takes seriously that it is the church who, as a whole, not a select few members of it, engage in a reflective act on the primary divine-human encounter that is worship, and that becomes expressed in changed praxis. It rightfully places emphasis on the encounter itself, conscious or unconscious, reflection on that encounter, and the changed faith and behavior as a result of that encounter. The object of concern of the liturgical theologian is then on the worship act itself, as concrete and as local as it is. This implies the need for a whole array of operations on the worship act, change, and response, which has been taken up by other liturgical theologians working with the assistance of the social sciences since Kavanagh's body of work was generated. And as you probably know, work in ritual studies has taken advantage of the research of cultural anthropology and social anthropology and has brought that into conversation with liturgical theology. Kavanagh also suggests that it's the responsibility of the liturgical theologian to be in dialogue with the array of secondary theological disciplines. He does not pursue this agenda, but it is one that I have repeatedly done in my work. It is my conviction that there is also a significant body of work by other theologians that considers the cycle of experience, reflection, and changed praxis outside of worship that needs to be attended to by the Church for the ongoing renewal of its worship. Notice that I did not just say that liturgical theologians need to be in dialogue with systematic theologians in some kind of intramural game in the halls of academe for its own sake, but I believe it's the role of all theologians to be involved in that communal cycle of divine human experience, reflection, and changed praxis. Theologians are not above, below, or outside of the believing and worshiping community. They are members of it, participating as believers, and serving it through the distinct disciplines that are part of the theological task. Theologians, liturgical and others, only serve the Church when they are embedded in it, and they contribute to its life and mission by the particular ministry that is theirs. This ministry includes having an impact on the worship of the church community. Perhaps this is where Kavanagh and I part company. For Kavanagh, the liturgical theologian studies the small and not so small structural changes that develop over time in the worship of the church. In his language, quote, the liturgiologist helps others read a score of right for what it really is, unquote. In this I fully agree, but it does not go far enough. The liturgical theologian, acting in dialogue with other theological disciplines, can also study the content of contemporary worship experience and consider its correlation with the faith, worldview, belief, and self-understanding of the community expressed in other forms of the life of grace. This does nothing to denigrate the importance of the divine-human encounter that is worship, but it does suggest that the Church engages the divine in other forms than just worship, and that these experiences and reflection upon them are helpfully put in dialogue with reflection on worship by the liturgical theologian. All this is by way of suggesting that liturgical change can not only be gradual and operate in a corporately unconscious manner, which is more of Kavanagh's approach, but that at times of significant paradigm shifts in the Church's worldview and self-understanding, the changes may be instigated deliberately by theologians who are exercising their ministry as embedded faith reflectors of the Church. While liturgical innovation is almost universally anonymous, with some Reformation figures obviously being exceptions like Luther and Thomas Cranmer, it does not negate the fact that at some point someone created a new structure, a new hymn, a new prayer, and inserted it into an already existing worship experience. As Paul Ricoeur has noted, while a work achieves its impact through distanciation, that is, its tradition of once a work is written, it then achieves more authority as it gets further and further away from the original person who did the creation of it. It cannot be denied that someone, somewhere, created the work of art in question. In the post-conciliar world that we have been in the last 50 years, many liturgical theologians have served on denomination worship committees and commissions that have created new rites, new worship books, new hymnals, new church designs, etc., etc. While in time their individual contributions will be lost in the world of anonymous, someone brought an agenda to the table. She or he brought a worldview and an ethos of the time and culture within which the church existed in the late 20th century and early 21st century. Consciously or unconsciously, they brought a specific cosmology to bear. a theology of God and human anthropology, or human self-understanding, a theology of the church, of justice, of salvation. And they reshape post-conciliar liturgy according to these terms. These revised orders of worship, in turn, became the context for the community's privileged encounter with the divine. No worship experience guarantees the encounter with divine mystery, for God will not be so manipulated. However, the actual shape of worship, both in its structure and its meaning, disclosed in multiple symbolic forms, provides the context within which the offer of divine self-disclosure and human response happens. My thesis is that liturgical theologians do have a role to play in the evolution of liturgical rites through the exercise of their craft in and with the community, and in dialogue with other scholars who are also reflecting on the religious experience of the church outside of formal worship. In the corpus of my work, my concern has been how the evolution in worldview and ethos and of emerging theological concerns get embedded in the worship life of the church. This is where I got into trouble. When my time here as a student, my ISM project was dealing with the impact of feminist theology on Christian worship. It was met with mixed feelings, shall I say. It's my conviction that liturgy both expresses the revelation of God in word and sacrament and the church's response, and also forms participants in those ways of faith, belief, and action. Likewise, I am convinced that significant changes in culture regarding our understanding of the world, God, and the human person have always worked their way into our worship services and need to do so again in our own day. Negatively, failure to do so results in a schizophrenic congregation who engages the living God according to the worldview and theology in the liturgy that may or may not be coherent or consistent with the worldview and theology of the contemporary worshiping community. The result of such a lack of correlation can lead the community to rationalize its adherence to two different worldviews and theologies by suggesting that the church is just slow to adjust, as indeed it is, to social change, or simply dismiss the worship of a given denomination as irrelevant and stop going, as they have been doing. Positively, this ongoing reform of liturgical worship projects a world in which the community may dwell, using Paul Ricoeur's language again, that is to some degree more coherent with the actuality, with the actual shape of the world than what came before it. No worship structure or content will ever be entirely coherent with the actuality of the divine or the world, because we're always growing in our understanding of divine mystery and of the human person and the mysteries of the cosmos. However, if it is part of the mystery of the human person to be always groping one's way forward to more adequate expressions of the truth, then the liturgies which we fashion and which fashion us will always be works in progress. All this is by way of saying, as Aidan would repeatedly, lex orandi legem statuat credendi. The law of praying constitutes the law of believing. You may have heard this, yes? Once or twice. Well, I suggest that that law still holds, but that the law of believing has and does influence the worship of the community. It is this influence that I want to pursue in the remainder of my talk. So now to the topic of shooting for the stars. Periodically, key new insights into the workings of the world reach a tipping point and cause a radical shift in cultural sensibilities. Even if the changes occur in one field of human endeavor, certain developments are of such consequence that their effects ripple out across the whole social spectrum. When this happens, the natural and the social sciences, philosophy, theology, and the arts share the burden of adapting to the new insights and reconfiguring the human imagination in light of them. Halfway through the second decade of the 21st century, we are at one of those key points, what we may call a paradigm shift. And if you remember, a paradigm shift is borrowed from Thomas Kuhn's 1962 work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And a paradigm shift is a revolutionary change of thinking in a field when the entire constellation of beliefs, values, and techniques that constituted a legitimate way of seeing the world is overturned in favor of a new set of values, techniques, and beliefs that better address the anomalies in the system. So the system, your set of techniques work for a while as the best thing that you can come up with until they stop working, and they stop working. And then you say, wait a minute, the whole worldview has to change. I need new techniques, new values, new ways of approaching a system that the old way of working simply does not address adequately. So Kuhn suggests that using the term paradigm shift to describe the movement from one set of theoretical rules and methods that no longer answer the problems of normal science to a new set of rules and methods that are simply more successful than their competitors. While Kuhn was speaking in terms of science, he certainly has provided language for us in other areas, and I think it's very helpful to use for my purposes here. So now we turn to the new cosmology. The discoveries of the hard sciences on the development of the cosmos and greater consciousness of ecological imbalances here on Earth constitute the paradigm shift of our age. Advances in genetics, paleontology, cosmology, astrophysics, quantum mechanics, evolutionary biology, and particle physics have all contributed to a radically new way of seeing the world and our place in it. The result is a new cosmology. The new ideas and theories of cosmic origins, development, and evolution suggest an enormous and dynamic universe and are replacing more limited and static views of the cosmos. We are being challenged to integrate into our whole worldview a cosmos that is extremely old, 13.82 billion years, enormously large, over 200 billion galaxies with over 100 million stars in each. When you start doing this research, the numbers just get so out of control that it's beyond imagination. And you'll get a sense of that in a moment. The cosmos is also infinitesimally small, matter as small as 10 to the negative 43 power microns. I can't even imagine how small that is. I can't imagine how small a proton is. And we also have come to the understanding that the cosmos is profoundly complex, dynamic, and interrelated. Narrative, the telling of a story we usually connect with human development and history, is now considered the best way to express the evolution of the cosmos. As theologian John Haught notes, one of the most surprising scientific discoveries of the past century and a half is that the universe is an unfolding story. The whole of nature, not just Earth and the human experience, has an essentially narrative character about it. That narrative character has implications for our own self-understanding, so that placing the human story within the universe story is necessary and helpful. As Brian Swim and Thomas Berry noted, cosmology aims at articulating the story of the universe so that humans can enter fruitfully into the web of relationships within the universe. The human person is part of a much larger story than we ever imagined. So let me tell you a story, the story of the universe. At an initial point, some 13.82 billion years ago, from an infinitesimally small and enormously dense mass, the universe exploded outward in a fireball that created space, time, energy, and matter, and has been expanding ever since. The theory of the origins of the universe, an initial Big Bang, or more elegantly, the primordial flaring forth, if you don't like Big Bang language, continues to hold sway in the scientific community at this time as the most reasonable explanation of the beginning of the known universe. Should that paradigm shift, we may come up with another language to speak about the origins of the universe, but at the moment, that's the operative one. At the risk of oversimplifying an extremely complex phenomenon, I'm going to give just a short version of the birth and the development of the cosmos. The story of the cosmos can be told in a series of eras marked by a decrease in temperature after the primordial flaring forth, which was judged to have been at 10 to the 32nd power degrees Kelvin. In the ensuing fractions of a second later, there was the emergence of the four fundamental forces that govern matter: the strong and weak nuclear force, the forces of gravity, and electromagnetism. The inflation era followed, where the entire universe grew from 1,000 millionth of the size of a proton to several centimeters. Again, the numbers are just overwhelming. Further declining temperatures allowed nuclear reactions to occur when hydrogen nuclei and helium nuclei formed out of the emerging plasma in the rate of 25% helium and 75% hydrogen. As the universe continued to expand, slight unevenness in density meant there were locations where large clouds of hydrogen and helium accumulated, causing the beginning of galaxies. Under the influence of gravity, these pockets of gas began to collapse and heat up until nuclear fusion created more helium from hydrogen, and stars were formed. Continuing nuclear reactions converted helium into the heavier elements, including the carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen from which we are made. We are, as Dennis Edward notes, the human community that springs from the fireball, which carried within itself the potentialities for the universe, which includes us and is unfolding around us. The universe story is truly our story. Now, just to click you back into worship mindset, I know I'm kind of far away from worship at the moment, but think of the cosmology that you sing in your hymn text. Think of the prayers that you pray in the ecology of your traditions. Is the cosmic narrative the narrative that you see there? And if it's not, should it be? And we'll get to that a little bit later. So now we turn to Earth's story and the human story. And I know you know some of this data, so please forgive me by going through it. But just as a quick review, the Earth was formed some 4.6 billion years ago. In the Milky Way galaxy, a supernova exploded and a new star, our sun, emerged from the debris. Bands of gas circled the sun and planets were formed. Of all the planets, only Earth has a size that produces a gravitational and electromagnetic balance which allows a solid rock crust to form around a burning core. Only Earth has a position in respect to the sun that establishes a temperature range in which complex molecules can form. Now, I have to say, since I wrote this, there have been discoveries of more planets and possibly discovery of water on Mars, I believe. Is that correct? Yeah, so I would, again, the paradigms are always shifting. While there is still some debate about the particulars of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, there is widespread agreement on the idea of evolution itself, even as it is extended through the work of Gregor Mendel and the later genetic scientists. Through the laws of nature, chance, and an enormous amount of time, life on this planet emerged and developed. Thanks to the work of molecular biologists, we have come to appreciate that every living creature on Earth is dependent on the DNA molecule, which emerged some 3 or 4 billion years ago. We still don't know how inert matter developed into living organisms, but we know that it happened. 2 billion years ago, sponges, algae, and fungi were dominant forms of life on Earth, while less than 1 billion years ago, the first animal life appeared as marine invertebrates. Higher forms of plant life emerged 400 million years ago, while bony fish, rays, and sharks swam the ocean depths, and fish-like amphibians took their first steps on dry land. In the Mesozoic era, from 251 to 65 million years ago, reptiles, then dinosaurs, dominated, while mammals and birds emerged some 150 million years ago. The Cenozoic period, 65 million years ago, saw the appearance of the first primates. We have evidence of creatures which we call Homo erectus from about 2 million years ago, while modern humans emerged some 200,000 to 150,000 years ago. In what may be called the Anthropic Principle, scientists tell us that had anything varied in the tiniest way from the way the universe actually unfolded, human life would not have evolved. Had the original dense particles of matter been just a bit larger, the nuclear explosions a bit hotter, had the rate of inflation been a bit faster or slower, had the electromagnetism and gravity forces, the strong and weak nuclear forces been a bit different, the universe would have collapsed in on itself or exploded outwardly too quickly for anything like galaxies and stars to have formed. So now I turn to the question of the new cosmology and Christian theology, which I think you're probably more interested in hearing what I'm going to do with that than the development of quarks. The evolving story of the universe and in our own Earth is causing us to rethink our understanding of God, the universe, and our place in it. Convinced that the new science can be in creative and helpful conversation with religion, systematic theologians like Dennis Edwards, Arthur Peacock, John Haught, Ilya Delio, and Elizabeth Johnson, among many others, have taken the paradigm shift to a new cosmology seriously and made considerable efforts to rethink our theologies of creation and redemption, God, Christology, pneumatology, and all the subsets of systematic theology. I'd like to focus just on 2 theologians working on the doctrine of creation and redemption and address the conversation between systematic and liturgical theologians, and finally suggest what this might mean for our worship life. The doctrine of creation that dates back to the 2nd century has traditionally been comprised of 3 aspects: creatio ex nihilo, creatio continua, and creatio nova. And those Latin terms mean exactly what you think they mean: creation from nothing, continuing creation, and the new creation at the end of time. Starting in that period, namely the 2nd century, Christian theologians made their claims for God's gratuitous creation of matter from nothing against the claims of the Platonics who argued for the co-eternity of God and matter, and against the Gnostics, who held the dualism of goodness and spirit on the one hand and evil and matter on the other. And Christian theologians have continued to hold these beliefs over the centuries in spite of philosophical and scientific claims to the contrary. Creatio nihilo, creation from nothing, maintains the absolute transcendence of God over creation. It also includes the teaching that the God of Judeo-Christian faith is the only God, and it is this God who is ground and source for all that exists. Creatio continua counters the deist notion of a God who created at the beginning and then simply allowed creation to develop on its own with no further intervention. And Creatio Nova teaches that God, who is the author of the new creation still to come in the fullness of time. Foundational to these three aspects are the ideas that creation is a free, loving act of God who empties self out in order to create something different from God's self, and that creation depends on God for its origins, its continuing existence, and its fulfillment in the time to come. With that as a background, let me just say a few words about John Hart's contribution. According to John Hart, one of the first and most important contributions the new cosmology has to theology is that it's brought the universe back into focus. You say, well, how can that be? How did the universe get out of focus? Well, in the time after Immanuel Kant, theology became very anthropocentric, or very human-centered. And that had many benefits to it, but it also had many disadvantages to it. And one of the disadvantages is that the conversation between science and religion that had been ongoing up until the 16th century broke in half, and scientists went in one direction and religionists went in another direction. Now, in our age, the whole cosmic story is the context through which human existence is explored. The second contribution that the new cosmology makes to theological reflection, Hart suggests, is the discovery that the universe is still evolving, which gives fresh emphasis to talk about creatio continua, the continuing work of God in creation. In addition, he argues that the fact that the universe is evolving around us and in us gives fresh support to Christianity's belief that a new creation is still ahead of us. So we have images of, think again of your worship life. How many images are there of the God who is above? Right? We have many, many, many of them. How many images have you heard of the God who is ahead at the end time? Not so much of that. So it's a different framework, it's a different metaphor to be using. A systematic theologian, Elizabeth Johnson, expands on Hart's work on creation and redemption and suggests that the turn to the cosmos and the evolutionary worldview science has brought us is pressing us to address the mystery of suffering and death that is endemic to all living life, living creatures. She suggests, and not everyone agrees with her, but her suggestion is that God suffers with all created beings, even unto death, and promises more. So let me say that again. That God suffers with all created beings, even unto death, and promises more. Now that has vast implications in our understanding of our terrible difficulty that we have in understanding why there is suffering in the world. And now not just human suffering, but the suffering of all living beings. It's very difficult to keep watching the Discovery Channel after you do some of this work, and the predation that is part and parcel of so many of the stories that you see on the Discovery Channel. And the question of why must there be predation? But it goes back to the first molecule that was able to draw life from another molecule next to it. That's the beginning of predation. Now it continues just on a grand scale in our world. Now that brings Johnson to a consideration of the redemption of all creation, traditionally addressed through the teaching of the new creation, the Creatio Nova. While she informs us that there has been a tradition from Irenaeus, Basil, and the late Augustine that envisions that all living beings were to be transformed into a new heaven and a new earth, there's a still longer list of Christian writers from Origen, the early Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Luther, and Calvin, who argued that, quote, God created all things, but will not necessarily save all things. That's quite a statement. God created all things, but God will not necessarily save all things. We have a long tradition of that. Brought to the most ridiculous termination, you asked as kids, will my dog go to heaven? And the answer you usually got, unless you had very understanding parents, was that no, your dog won't. Well, I had a cat that needed redemption badly. And I have hope now that she will be redeemed and will no longer think with her teeth, if you get my drift. Anselm, in his theory of atonement, if you recall, related the saving work of Jesus Christ primarily to humanity and left the redemption of all creation to the side. Theologians Karl Rahner and Edward Schillebeeckx, writing in the mid-20th century, brought the question of God's salvific love for all creation back into focus. Retrieving the biblical witness to the promise of redemption for all creation and recovering a more Franciscan view of the incarnation as intended for all time, whether or not we sinned, contemporary theologians are once again recognizing that the resurrected Christ is the witness to what is possible for all of creation. And that's quite a statement. Reflecting on the empty tomb of the gospel narrative, Johnson says, quote, the tomb may be empty, but far from departing the earth, the risen Christ remains in its midst as the first exemplar of the radiance that awaits all being. It's a wonderful sentence. The first exemplar of the radiance that awaits all being. The conviction of creation's beginning and final redemption in God cannot be scientifically proved, of course, but rests on faith in the God of love who pours self out to all creation and who is as concerned with its fulfillment as much as with its origins. There is continuity between the love of God that creates, holds in continual creation, and redeems at the end time, whenever and whatever that will be. So now, liturgical and systematic theologians in dialogue. So having looked at these two small examples of John Haught and Elizabeth Johnson, it's time to look now at what this second-order reflection has to contribute to first-order liturgical theology and to the liturgical prayer of the community. In other words, I am interested in the influence of secondary theology on the primary theology Kavanagh articulated in his work. At this juncture, the systematic theologians of our churches are at the front lines of exploring the evolutionary and ecological worldview and our belief system, and are outpacing anything that's being done in liturgical studies. It's just true. The systematic theologians have been doing this work for 20 or 30 years, and it has not really filtered into the liturgical conversations. So I would suspect that those of you who are in classes on liturgy haven't really dealt very much with the new cosmic story and liturgy. No? I see some heads shaking no. Well, it's time. First, what does systematic theology have to say to historians of the liturgy? Recall that I suggested that systematic theologians have advanced work on creation from nothing, continual creation, and new creation in light of the work on the new cosmology. Let me just skip down a little bit. Well, what has this got to do with liturgiologists? I suggest that a real service to the churches would be a careful study of the euchology or the prayer traditions of East and West to see what they say of original creation, continuing creation, and the new creation. What's out there? Do we have a good sense of that? Are we following the tradition of Origen, the early Augustine, Luther, Calvin, in terms of their understanding of the cosmos? It would really be interesting to know what we have there in our euchology tradition. We must recognize the symbolic nature of scriptural language and liturgical text, and the fact that they resist a literal reading. However, that being said, we can pose a series of questions to them. Do our texts support the goodness of all creation, matter and spirit? Do our texts speak of the incarnation of Christ in flesh, which we can understand as the taking up into God all created reality? Do our texts speak of God's solidarity in Christ in all creation suffering and death, or are they primarily anthropocentric? Do they weave biblical texts which do address the redemption of all creation, and we have them, Romans 8, Colossians 1, Ephesians 1, Revelations 5 and 21, among others? Do they weave these texts into our euchology and lectionaries, or are they focused on just human redemption? And again, think of your prayers that you know from your own tradition and what they say. The liturgy, of course, is not just text, but it's the entire worship act and its environment. So we can also ask if the pictorial programs that grace our worship spaces value spirit over matter, or take the redemption of all creation into account. Do our images contextualize the human experience within the greater cosmic story? Do our images reflect an Anselmian view of the cross, sin, and redemption, or do they reflect the Franciscan view that God always intended to send the Christ whether we sinned or not? The same questions could be posed to our hymn text. We hymn writers have put words into the mouths of our assemblies. What theology of creation and redemption have we had them learn by heart? So this initial exploratory effort leads to another more creative effort that brings the new insights of systematic theology to bear on our worship experience. In other words, we shift from historical liturgical theology to the work of liturgists who are actually shaping the elements of worship experience. So here we attend to the influence of secondary theology on primary theology. As I said earlier, in the post-conciliar period, many liturgical scholars have been involved in the renewal and rewriting of worship books and hymnals, etc. While an enormous amount of work has been done, there is still much work that awaits us. In addition, there are the elements of liturgy that are always changing in large or small ways, such as some spontaneous prayers, hymnody, which changes more frequently than the worship texts themselves, preaching, and the artistic programs of our churches. especially in those churches whose worship services are not subject to tight controls and slow approval processes, like my own. Liturgists have the opportunities to work with the sciences and with other theologians and to bring those conversations into dialogue with the shaping of those euchological forms, hymn text, and image programs. To the degree that we understand that we are called to ever move forward into knowledge of God and the world, I suggest that we are morally bound to do so. Our assemblies depend upon the shapers of the traditions to articulate as best they can our evolving knowledge of God, ourselves, and the cosmos. The type of language in which this is done is not the technical language of second theology. Rather, it's done with the skill of the artist who, as Emily Dickinson says, tells the truth, but tells it slant. Let the language be as evocative and imaginative as the Hubble Space Telescope's pictures are awe-inspiring. Let the languages of worship, which include the universe story, entice people into the divine-human encounter, which is followed by reflection and change praxis. In other words, in the doing of primary theology. Perhaps if we attend to all this, we will have gone a long way to sensitize our people to the ecological challenges we face on Earth, to move us to act on Earth's behalf, and to give credence to the promise of redemption for the whole expanding cosmos. As Kavanagh was right to point out, worship, the divine human experience which initiates change in the assembly, should lead us to change action outside of worship. On the other hand, our worshiping communities might already be conversant with the new cosmology, as I take it many of you are. As I was going through the Cosmos story, you knew all that material. And they probably are waiting for their liturgies and their theologians to catch up. We must be honest and admit that we know very little about our worshiping assemblies, what they actually do believe and think, particularly about the inbreaking of God in their everyday lives and how that relates to official liturgies and pronouncements. The experience of everyday religious spiritual behavior is just beginning to be studied, and we have yet to bring this data into our theological schools and guilds, ministerial meetings, and preparation for preaching. So I conclude with a return to lex orandi, legem statuat credendi. Rather than seeing worship as primarily founding doctrine and stopping there, we can also appreciate the mutual influence of doctrine and belief on worship. Secondary theology has much to offer primary theology in this dynamic. As embedded reflectors on the tradition and living communities, systematic and liturgical theologians can help to reshape the tradition in ways that bring the paradigm shift of the new cosmology into our worship, creating the context within which the divine human encounter can take place in a privileged way, and assisting the community to do its ongoing work of primary theology. Thank you.